Now, Secretary General of the Good Party, Brett Herron, has written a column about Walus's parole and how it brings imbalance and post-apartheid justice. He joins us now to unpack this further. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. Now, this is a judgment that's left many in shock because the majority of South Africans essentially were, and perhaps are still of the view that Janusz Walus should not have been given parole unless, of course, he disclosed the full details that led to the assassination of the beloved SACP leader. You're of the view that Walus is entitled to the just mercy of the South African constitutional order. Talk to us about that.
Well, I was of the view that the Constitutional Court, in coming to its conclusions, was implementing the law, and the Constitutional Court is only able to do that. It cannot go beyond the law. And so it was implementing an interpretation of the Correctional Services Act and the policies that various ministers of correctional services and justice have developed over the years. So his release, or the order that he be released on parole, is based in the legislation and the policies that have been developed by the democratic ministers of justice and correctional services. But what I was really writing about in the piece was the anger, the frustration, and the pain that many South Africans feel and experience, and that this decision has evoked, lies in the imbalance in our justice system. And as we have just heard, post-apartheid South Africa's justice system is imbalanced because we haven't dealt with so many of the atrocities that occurred under apartheid, in terms of reparations, in terms of prosecutions of those who perpetrated those atrocities and did not get amnesty through the TRC system, and in terms of failing to return land to those who have lodged land restitution claims. So you have a whole host of failures in the post-apartheid era that creates the environment in which the release of Walus is seen as unfair, and that there's an imbalance in justice in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Many are of the view that the judges should have perhaps taken into consideration that this case is unlike any other. It has many unanswered questions, and the failure of Walus to disclose this matter means that he is still unrepentant. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's not. I mean, we live in a constitutional order where the Constitutional Court is the highest court of our land, and there's a separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the Constitution and the judiciary. And the judiciary can only implement the law as it is written. The Constitutional Court found that Walus qualified for this parole and had met all the requirements in policy and legislation. If we want to have in that policy and legislation conditions that are not there now, then it is up to the government and the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services to create that legislation or that policy. But in the absence of that policy and in the absence of any provision that now seems to be a gap or a loophole, the court implements the law as it stands. So we can't second guess that. But I don't want to disregard the anger and the frustration and the pain that this release and this order is causing. And that is why I wrote the piece that if South Africa had transformed over the last 30 years to the country that many of us had hoped it would be 30 years after democracy, the outrage and the pain may not be as evocative as it has been, because we haven't achieved much in terms of reparations, restitution, redress and transformation in the last 30 years.
Yeah, and I understand, as I read through the article, you also use the parliamentary questions process to perhaps get a sense on government and how it perhaps had so little appetite to deal with the wrongs inherited from the past, going as far as asking why did officials even bother establishing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission if there were no intentions to hold those who did not receive amnesty accountable in terms of the law.
Yeah, and those answers to my questions have really led me to write this piece because it's an accumulation of wrongs, I think, in the post-apartheid era, which has led to this imbalance of justice. I mean, there are several hundred, 200 odd perpetrators of apartheid atrocities who did not get amnesty through the TRC system, who have not yet been prosecuted. And many of them are dying without ever being prosecuted, leaving families without a sense of justice. There are families who are still fighting for justice for the loss of lives of their loved ones. We had, in response to one of my questions, the Minister of Police said that the prosecutions had been deprioritized for over a decade. So the use of the parliamentary questions and the answers I've received really exposes this government as having little appetite to deal with righting the wrongs that existed prior to 1994.
You also speak about the golden thread that seems to be the state's steadfast unwillingness to implement the recommendations of the TRC, even going as far as posing some of your questions to Minister of Justice Ronald Lamola about this. What was that response and interaction like?
Well, I was asking, there is a golden thread. There's the failure to prosecute the perpetrators of human rights abuses and violence and murder, where those were not, for those people who were not granted amnesty through the TRC system. There is the President's Fund that was set up to pay reparations to victims of apartheid abuses, and there's still about 4,000 of those victims who have not yet been paid. And that President's Fund that was established has just accumulated a 1.8 billion rand surplus, which has not been spent on community projects or any form of reparations. There's the failure to resolve the land restitution process. So when I raised what I raised with Minister Lamola was whether the South African government had given up on the project of nation building, which gave rise to reparations, restitution, and this President's Fund being established to fund this. He denied that the government has given up on nation building. But in the absence of prosecutions, reparations, and land restitution, the frustration and the pain that South Africans feel right now with the murderer of Chris Hani being released is understandable.
Where do you think, or, upon observation, and as you ask these very crucial questions, where do you think the main challenge may have been, or perhaps the downfall in terms of implementation and ensuring that justice is indeed served? Where do you think that may have happened along the way?
Well, I mean, we know that shortly before the last apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk, passed away, his foundation released a statement which implies that there was some sort of deal that was crafted between during the negotiations that led to our democracy, and that deal may well have involved some sort of informal amnesty that led to what the answer to my question was, that the prosecutions of these atrocities was deprioritized. So, in some way in that statement, there's an implication that there was some secret deal that is yet to be disclosed by anybody. But it does explain perhaps why the National Prosecuting Authority did not prosecute almost 300 perpetrators of apartheid violence, murder, assault, and who did not get amnesty, why those prosecutions did not take place and are only now being investigated.
Very well. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. Let's leave it there for now. Brett Herron, the Good Party Secretary and member of the National Assembly.